Welcome to the Explainer series, brought to you by the Community Policy Forum. The objective of this series is to impart information on topics in a concise and digestible way, serving as a stepping stone for further engagement and discussion. In this episode, we are joined by Jodie, the Policy and Campaigns Officer at Liberty, to discuss the impact of the Public Order Act on the right to protest. The Public Order Act came into effect on the 3rd of May 2023 and has been described by Liberty as a new piece of legislation that brings in severe new curbs on the right to protest and hands a raft of new powers to the police. To kickstart our conversation, Jodie, could you please provide an overview of what the Public Order Act is and its aims?
Thank you so much for having me. So the Public Order Act 2023, as you mentioned, came into force just under a year ago. Across the board, the Act introduces a range of criminal offences and behavioural orders that massively contribute to the shrinking of space for our dissent and for our ability to stand up to power. And although the bill contains a lot of different measures, I'll focus on a couple. So the first one is the Public Order Act brings into force a new criminal offence of locking on. The wording of this offence is really, really broad and really vague, which means that anyone, even people who aren't protesting, could fall foul of it. This offence kind of targets people who engage in one of the following things, and bear with me because it's incredibly broad and really absurd when I hear myself reading it out. So the first one is that it targets people who attach themselves to another person, an object or land, attaches another person to another person, object or land, or attaches an object to another object or land. And if doing that thing will cause what the kind of legislation refers to as serious disruption, then to two or more people, then you kind of fall foul of that. And punishment for that offence is maximum 51 weeks in prison, a fine, or both upon conviction if you're kind of prosecuted and convicted of that. And I guess the main thing to say about this offence is that we have the right to choose how we protest and what tactics we use. That's a right that's protected by the ECHR, it's kind of affirmed in case law. And this kind of offence is a real kind of attack on that. And the wording, how broad that is, really paves the way for really broad disproportionality. For example, the definition of attach could mean a whole host of non-criminal activities, such as linking arms with one another, or wrapping your arms around a tree, or locking your wheelchair to traffic lights, which, is a tactic used by disability rights movements. And by criminalising things that wouldn't be criminal if it weren't for this offence, that creates a real chilling effect on protest. It factors into people's decision making. The decision starts to become, can I really afford to go to this protest if there's such an enormous risk that I might be fall foul of police contact, or be arrested for doing something that I have a right to do. And we've already seen this offence be used. Two main examples that kind of cover what I said about this could impact people who aren't even protesting, but it also impacts people who are protesting. So we saw last summer, shortly after the offence came into force, that a woman attending Royal Ascot, so dressed up, going to see horse racing, was actually arrested by police because they found some nail glue in her bag, and they believed that would be used for the purposes of locking on, attaching herself to something. And then the other example is the human rights nightmare that was the King's coronation. We saw so many protesters arrested over on the day and over that weekend. One example is a group of protesters with the group Republic who were arrested for carrying luggage straps that they were just using to kind of bundle their placards all together. So we're already seeing this the kind of harmful impact of this come to fruition. And the second thing that I'll speak about in terms of what's actually in the bill is, and it kind of links really well to locking on, it's the introduction of new protest-specific stop and search powers, which sees the police stopping people to find things that they believe have been used or will be used at a protest to commit a protest-related offence. And so firstly, you've got the creation of those new protest-related offences, like locking on, and then you've got the ability of police to search you on the basis that they suspect or not even suspect or don't have reasonable suspicions that you're locking on or being equipped to lock on. And before the Public Order Act, the police could only stop and search people in very specific circumstances, and that would be in relation to so-called serious violent or drugs offences. And we also need to look at that critically too, right? In the ways that stop and search has historically and continues to be used disproportionately against racialized communities. But broadly, the expansion of stop and search to protest contexts gives the police a very, very broad power to stop and search people, because there's potentially an endless list of objects that could be what the legislation states as made, adapted, or intended for use in the course or connection with a protest-related offence. So that could be a bike lock that you're using to lock your bike up, whether you're going to a protest or you're just kind of locking your bike up near the site of a protest, then going somewhere else. You know, glue, nail glue, like I just said. You could attach yourself with nail glue to something. You know, the list is kind of endless. And we also need to factor in, you know, stop and search is really widely discredited, and it has been for many, many years, for the way that it is used predominantly against racialized communities, particularly young Black men. And it's also a power that creates immense harm when it is used. The trauma of stop and search is long lasting. In the case of young people, for example, who often are stopped and searched, that really impacts their ability to form bonds with other adults, to build trust with other adults, to form bonds among their peers as well. Like it's something that we really must take seriously when we are kind of resisting the use of these powers. And in that respect, it's kind of beyond kind of opposing these measures in a legislative sense. It's really important to be doing that work on the ground to inform people of their rights, to challenge stops when they happen, as this kind of begins to be used, particularly in a much broader context. And then just the final thing that I'll touch on within the bill is the introduction of a serious disruption prevention order, which are kind of new court-imposed civil orders that can be imposed on individuals who, on 2 or more occasions in the past 5 years, have been convicted of a protest-related offence or breached a protest injunction. So the police can apply for these, or you can be given one on top of a conviction for another offence. Say that you were in court for a second time being prosecuted for locking on, for example, and the court basically needs to prove that or believe that a serious disruption prevention order is necessary to prevent an individual from committing a further protest-related offence or preventing a person from helping someone else commit a protest-related offence. And as I kind of said in relation to stop and search, you know, to kind of fall foul of all of these different things. And if you imagine a situation where, you know, you are in court for locking on a second time and you're maybe given a suspended sentence and a fine, you can be given a serious disruption prevention order on top of that. So it's effectively layers of punishment and layers of criminalisation. And the root of that is that it's on the basis of something that is our protected right. You know, we have a right to, you know, express our dissent, to stand up to power. And that's incredibly important. But with the Public Order Act, but also the act that came just a year before that, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, you know, we're seeing layers and layers of kind of legal, of power, police powers and legislation and new offences that are really kind of stifling people's ability to freely express their dissent and to stand up to power. Given the amount of legislation we've seen in recent years and the fact that we know that by this government, there's a real intention there to kind of clamp down on protests, and especially particular protest movements, whether it's racial justice movements, movements around climate justice, movements that are in solidarity with Palestine. You know, this is very targeted. The important thing to say there is that we need to hold two things at once. We need to hold the fact that there's a greater risk associated with protest in terms of the weight of the kind of law now, given the amount of legislation we've seen. But we also need to hold the fact that protest hasn't been banned. I think sometimes I think it's an understandable thing when people say our right to protest has been banned because of this legislation, because it feels like the landscape for protest has really gotten much, much smaller. It hasn't been banned. We still have our right to protest still exists. I think there are just greater costs associated with doing that, especially, for communities that are already marginalized, are already criminalized or harassed by the police disproportionately. And so whether you're somebody who's planning a protest, whether you're attending a protest, whether you have friends that are attending a protest and you're interacting with them afterwards, like, we all kind of have a duty to keep each other safe. And that could look like receiving a bust card at a protest, which is a kind of a little card that legal observers give out, that kind of say what your rights are and have some details of solicitors that you could call if you are arrested. Legal observers, I mean, the existence of legal observers is super important to have that accountability for police at protests. You can also train to be a legal observer, or just in a very broad sense, kind of keep informed with what your rights are as the landscape for protest legislation keeps changing. And Liberty's Advice and Information Hub is a really great resource for that, where it kind of breaks down in a really accessible way what the legislation is saying and what it isn't. So yeah, that's really important.
Well, that concludes our discussion. Thank you so much, Jodie, for joining us today. To learn more about the Public Order Act, please make sure to check out Liberty's work, which you will find in the description down below.